Need to create a complex enterprise Angular application? Angular Bootcamp is an intensive 3-day workshop class to learn the basics of Angular through sophisticated techniques for real-world applications. We target Angular 6 and the recent versions, with much of the curriculum is suitable back to Angular 2. Or go beyond the 3-day class with a consultation or project launch with Oasis Digital, the team behind Angular Bootcamp. We can assist your team or launch your project with advanced Angular topics including scalability, data flow, state management, full-stack product design, and more. Contact us for a private class at your location or buy a ticket for public classes in various cities around the U.S. and occasionally in Europe. Online live instructor training is also available at angularbootcamp.com. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Adventures in Angular podcast. This week on our panel, we have John Papa.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Alyssa Nicholl.
Hello, hello.
Joe Eames.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Go check out getacoderjob.com if you're looking for a job. We also have a special guest this week, and that's Dave Bush.
Hello.
Should I say Dave Bush or Dave M. Bush?
Dave Bush is good. Dave M. Bush is all over the web.
You want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, I'm a programmer. I've been programming for 30 years, most recently in the .NET space and even more recently in the JavaScript space. Started using Angular with the release candidate 0, and yeah, that's basically what I've been doing since it came out.
Nice. So we brought you on because you wrote this article, Where to Store Angular Configurations.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting. And I have a few things that we could talk about here and a few questions. I'm also curious to hear from the rest of the panel how they handle some of this stuff. So, but just to give us a little bit of context, it looks like you've been blogging for a while. What was the inspiration for this particular blog post?
Most of my blog posts like that are born out of frustration, where I see a recurring problem. I've actually been contracting for most of the time that I've been programming. I just took a full-time job, but the contracting actually has me moving around a lot. And so with the Angular stuff in particular, I'm actually at the second place where they're using Angular and running into a lot of the same types of problems. So, what I saw was using the environment prod file for configurations because that gets loaded every time. At the previous place, we've been loading from a database, and then kind of along about that, we saw the app initialize hook in Angular, and that looked like a nice, clean way to actually pull everything together.
I love it. So you're an angsty blogger.
Right. So you mentioned at the very beginning, and you mentioned it just now, that a lot of people are putting it in like environment.ts or environment.prod.ts.
Right.
Why isn't that a good idea? Because I'm sure somebody's sitting there going, "Hey, I do that and it works."
Yeah. The basic problem with that is you can never be entirely sure that when you move something from dev to QA to production, that your code hasn't changed. You can put different things in place, and we're in an organization where I was working. They just tagged every build so that it could actually build from that build. But because of the way NPM works, it's not that you can't get around it, but it's a little tricky to be sure that what you actually built the second time is exactly what you built the first time, because you might get a different version of the package in the process of rebuilding. And so this way, I know for sure when I move it along, the only thing that changed was either the physical environment that it's in, maybe firewall rules or something are a little funky, or my config's not set up correctly. Just limits where I look for bugs.
Gotcha. So that file does load every time, though. So it's just a matter of, like you said, managing dependencies and things like that may move.
Right.
So you walk through some other scenarios in here, and one of them is just setting up like a config file that you do a GET request for. So it's kind of a static config file.
Yes.
So do you want to just talk us through that? I mean, so you just pull in the JSON and have some service that parses it? Is that the idea?
Yeah, and this is actually where we're currently working, this is what we're using. So we have the config.json. You use a regular GET request against it, and then our deploy process knows there's actually a config.dev.json and config.qa.json, config.prod.json, and our deployment process knows if I'm deploying to this machine, it gets this config file and renames it to config.json. So my code always knows load config.json no matter where you are, and you'll get the right information. But it's a pretty straightforward GET request, and because it's a JSON file, there's not really a lot of wizardry involved in it. It just load the file like you would from any REST endpoint.
So is there a downside to that then?
Well, the only real downside is if you want to change it, you got to copy a new config up. Yeah, which leads to the other possible method is you go into you're basically putting stuff in a database, so you can actually make a genuine REST call against that store. And what that does for you is you've got a production issue, and you want to be able to replicate that issue using production data, hopefully not actually doing any writes, but in another environment where you can actually change the files easier. And by using a database, you can point stuff to different endpoints along the way without having to necessarily deploy a whole new configuration into your environment to get those changes. It just makes things a little bit more, a little easier. You're still going to have to possibly bounce the application or bounce the server to get those new configurations because it's going to load it up front, not load it while it's running. But it's a Control F5.
Gotcha.
All right, so hold on a second. You're talking about I've got the configuration locally and I want to make a change locally, but I can't because the configuration is on the server, so I have to upload it to the server, right?
No, I'm talking if you want to replicate it, say, on your dev server, and which is different from the local development. So most of the places that I've worked, they do all of the actual development, localhost. We'll call that local.
Right. Sure.
And then there's a dev server that they deploy it on, where they do most of the integration testing from a developer perspective. And then it moves from there to QA, which is where our end users look at it, and the QA department looks at it, and then from QA to prod. So I'm talking, you've got say you had a problem in the QA environment, and you want to be able to replicate it in your dev environment. And you can't replicate it because the data is different in those two different environments.
Gotcha. Okay, so you mentioned in your article the what is it? The app app initializer?
Yes.
Event. Okay. So this app initializer event is going to execute on the browser, right? It's going to make a GET request to the server, grab the configuration file, and pull it down to the browser?
Yes.
All right. So isn't there also then another cost in this method in that you've introduced some kind of a startup delay in the application when the user first hits the website?
That's true. However, it's very minor. I've never actually visibly seen it. So it's technically true, but experientially not true.
Well, so it probably depends on your application, of course, right? And the needs of your application. Like for a lot of stuff that you build, the startup time is going to be very minor. When we get to where, hey, I've got to build something that executes for a whole bunch of people, and we want like a 1 second startup time on a mobile device, right? Then this type of technique, when you've already gone to server-side rendering and found out that even that isn't fast enough. So you probably cut this out of your process by then. But when you're talking, hey, I've got an application that a lot of people use, and the load time is, if I can shave 50 milliseconds off the load time, I don't really care, right? Which is probably a significant, in my experience, has been, I haven't written an application where shaving 50 seconds off the milliseconds off the load time mattered. Shaving a megabyte off the download size might have mattered to cut it down from 6 megs to 5, but
Right.
shaving 50 milliseconds off the load time doesn't matter. But it does definitely have an effect if you are building an application where you're trying to target like, hey, we want a responsive application in a second and a half. Then you're already going to be trimming so many pieces of fat.
Right. You might be able to find some of that too in just the download size of the various lazy load bundles that you're bringing down. There's different ways of chopping up the application so the first hit doesn't take that long, because your config file is really not that big.
It's interesting because you're right. There is a startup cost to it, but I think it's all dependent upon what you're doing during that startup time period too. If, like, for example, you would never recommend, I would hope, that somebody makes an API call that takes 45 seconds before they start their Angular app,
Oh, right. No.
So there are things that you optimize, like, and you really only get the data you absolutely need at that startup. And I got to tell you, as many large scale apps as I've written with Angular, even Angular.js, and even before it, I've used a similar process like this. There's just always something you need to know before you start it to truly make an environment agnostic.
Right.
Did you ever work with Angular.js? Because they had a version of this in there as well, using the manual bootstrap.
I worked with it long enough to say that I have, but not enough to get it. Like, I don't have as much experience with it as I do with the newer Angular.
Yeah, it's interesting. I only reference that there because it's a very similar process. Effectively, and I'm going to just kind of simplify how I explain it to people, is what they did there is you effectively cranked up a little tiny Angular app that had no visual form whatsoever. You injected the service you need, made the HTTP call, grabbed it back, and then you were able to take a service from that one and shove it into the real Angular app. It wasn't very elegant, but it worked. What I like about the app initializer is it's basically looks like it's all part of the same app, right? I mean, looking through your article, it's really part of your app. It's just a different provider.
Yeah. And actually, before I discovered this, I did an implementation that basically, just used some fancy observables or promises to get the data and make sure I had the data before I continued on. So
yeah, I've even seen people do like jQuery or Axios or things like that. There's other ways too, right? Where people would just do a straight HTTP call before the thing and then call it. I've also seen where people take like JSON data and serve it up inside of a template inside the index HTML. And then they'll read that as the first thing when the Angular app starts. I mean, there's lots of ways to do this. What I really liked about your article is you say right off the bat, don't use that environment file that Angular gives you. And I'm 100% with you there, because I feel like even just by the name of those files, it makes it sound like, oh, this is the perfect place to do it.
Right.
It's not.
And once you discover that, only one or the other compiles when you build, it's really attractive.
Yeah, but you would think, again, looking at the names of those files, that environment TS compiles every time and environment prod compiles only in prod.
Yeah, the question I get a lot, and I had it literally on Twitter, I think yesterday, I could go find it. I get it a lot, is, I'm oversimplifying again, but Angular's terrible. The only way I can make something work on staging and production is to rebuild the entire thing, because they see those file names. And, unless you have somebody sitting next to you, that's not very clear. I personally feel like those names should be changed. And honestly, I don't even use those files personally.
I don't either. I leave them there so that I can get a prod version, but I'd really rather have that even be a config. But I haven't tried making them a config, and they're part of the build process, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, because the idea is, and tell me if you agree, like I've always wanted to make one build that would work in any environment. And I've had places where I worked where there's 7 different environments. And all you do is change like a node environment variable, and everything just kind of figures itself out.
Right. Yeah,
that's a nice way to approach things, right? But a lot of time that doesn't necessarily, certainly when you're talking about like a local build, you got an optimized build, right? So at least when you're talking about not a dev server, but like I'm running locally on dev, you're probably not going to be using that same build and moving it around because it's going to be unoptimized. And depending on the technology, I think with Angular, that's probably not an issue. But with other technologies, it might be that you want to build slightly differently based on the environment. But with Angular, it seems like they're really moving things towards having only, your local dev build is a little unoptimized, but man, they're really making a lot of optimizations even there so that it's starting to use it's being compiled ahead of time compiled, and that's getting faster and faster. And now with the new, what's the name of that new thing? I'm blanking on the name. The new rendering compiler engine.
Oh, Ivy?
Ivy. With Ivy, right? There could be even more advances here. But then once you're done, you create that one truly optimized build, and then that could be the same thing in all environments.
Right. And even, I'm favoring, making that even my development experience as close to what's going to happen in production. Because before we got the AOT all the time, I ran into situations where the developer would build it locally and it would work and commit. And then when we would go to build it for production or QA or whatever dev for one of the servers, it wouldn't even build. Right. And so I started implementing, I don't care that it takes 30 seconds longer. You're going to compile it for AOT while you're doing development, just so that when you commit it, we know it still builds. I've also put some pre-commit hooks in, and we have a Mariner process that runs on our GitHub now that actually builds everything. So we don't merge unless that Mariner process says everything's good.
Yeah, I ran into a lot of those same issues. There's just a lot of stuff that you could do without the AOT that you can't do with it. And
right.
If you aren't building for the AOT frequently, you don't encounter those things. Now, what about source maps?
One of the things the AOT does, though, is it also tells you you've got an error. How I say this? It tells you have a runtime error before you actually run the code, and it shows up in the console window that you never look at.
Yeah, they do put some stuff funny. All right, so let's talk about source maps. What about source maps? Because obviously I want them in my local development build, but I might want them on some of my staging servers so that when we encounter problems there, I can look around and see the source maps. But I'm pretty sure I don't want them on production.
Right.
So how do you have a way for handling that? Is that a configuration setting again? I mean, obviously producing the same build, moving around, ripping out the source maps. I don't think I've ever tried doing that before myself.
With our build process, I believe we could. I don't think we are, but I believe we could say, when you deploy, because it all ends up in the dist directory. And what we do with the dist directory is we basically create a tarball out of it. So you can selectively, say, create a tarball, but don't include the map files.
Have you ever ran into that issue, John?
Yeah, what I've done most often is, again, one build. I'm not talking local dev. Once it gets into our GitHubs and other places for source control, the CI
deployment pipeline.
Yeah, once it gets into the pipeline, there's always a build, and the build is the same thing, and the environments for the 7 different environments or more just get flags. The only time we change or deviate is if there's some kind of a problem, then we do a special build with source maps and debug symbols, and we deploy to a dev server to do that. We tried stripping out source maps and sometimes, and it works, but honestly, I just found that we so infrequently ever debugged on those servers that it was easier to just rebuild, deploy to that server, debug it, rebuild. Because when I did debug, it was like a constant rebuild anyway. So,
yeah. Anybody ever encountered an issue where having the source maps is actually the issue?
Yes, I have. Exactly.
Have you really? Oh my! I've never encountered that myself. I was joking.
I haven't either.
Hell yeah. I even had somebody try to deploy source maps to production once, and can I say hell yeah on this? Is this rated for it? It actually slowed down. It slowed down the perceived performance of the app when it cranked up, and we were getting yelled at for, oh my gosh, what did you all do? It now takes 7 seconds to load the app.
Does this got to load the map files? Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Side note, John, and when this goes live, it'll actually be used somebody else dubbing in with golly gee willikers. That's how we edit out the swears.
Oh, cool. So you're telling me I can swear every 4 seconds.
Especially if you want to be saying golly gee a lot.
Golly gee. So now I feel like I'm back on Leave It to Beaver.
I don't know. I don't think I pay in the editor enough to do all that.
So if we were Leave It to Beaver, let's think now. That would make me Beaver in that case, and that would make Joe Eddie Haskell. If you're not familiar with that show, go check it out. So Dave, I have to ask you, stepping back from this whole thing, I can appreciate this. I can relate. I lived this story many times. But a couple things to just think about that I've been asked, and I'm curious what your opinion is. Going down this road, why bother? Why not just use, forget the environment prod flags. Like, we know that means you have to make a different build each time, but why not choose one of the other 4 or 5 ways that people have hacked around this over the years?
Like what other ways?
Like one of them, for example, would be to just take your config information in a file, like you've got some file names set up, whatever, and your server could just embed it inside of your index.html. That's one way to go.
Okay. Right.
You could also wait till the app is loaded, and you could hit an API like right after the app is loaded and kind of flip for things. I've seen a lot of weird hacks throughout the years.
Yeah.
Not framework-specific hacks, just web hacks.
Right. As I said, before I found App Initializer, I was doing once the app was loaded, go get the configuration information. Simply because I didn't know about App Initializer. I think App Initializer is a much cleaner way to do it. Just because I don't have to, basically I don't have to manage the waiting process, for the sync the promise resolve. So it's cleaner, it's simpler. I don't have to do as much work, and I certainly don't have to think as hard. The one where you're embedding the stuff in the index file, I've seen that before. I forget what environment it was. That one is probably workable as long as you're running a server that is generating that information on the fly dynamically. Or you somehow embed it into your index.html file as part of your build process. But yeah, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, because you can't do that, right? It'd be more like, let's say you're using Node.js. It could be any platform. It could be PHP, right, ASP.NET. And as the server serving up index.html, it makes a call from server to server to go get that config and embeds it into a template tag, for example.
Right.
Or the old style script tags where we used to put data in a script tag like that.
Right. And one of the things I like about, particularly the way we're doing Angular development, is all of our Angular files are just served up by Node Express that serves up static files. I really don't need any middleware to serve up my Angular code. And my REST endpoints typically end up being in both the environments that I've worked in. It ended up being on completely different servers. So there's really no reason for my Express server to be serving up anything that's dynamically generated.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/adventures.
Was there another method you had seen?
Nothing worth giving people bad ideas for. Sometimes I'm afraid on air to talk about things I've seen.
We don't want to tell them how to do it wrong, right?
Yeah, then people will be like, next day on Twitter, you're hearing, oh, John Papa told me to do it this way. No.
Speak to the fact that deployments and builds and all that sort of stuff, I definitely see like that is one of those places where everybody does it a little bit differently because the needs of the apps are so varied, and it's the least place that you have like these uniform examples to just follow, right? I mean, as much as people take a really opinionated framework and still write things radically different from another group, then you get to the DevOps section and it's like so crazy. You pair in the needs of the back end, it just gets nuts, right? Oh, it's totally different if it's Node versus if it's Microsoft and .NET versus if it's Java, how things work, how you build. And rarely are you just building your front end in isolation, right? Oftentimes you got to build the back end too in a similar time, right? They need to be paired up together, and that build process is entirely different. Coordinating the two can be a real pain in the
back
butt.
end, Joe. That's ridiculous.
Let's go serverless. There's an interesting Twitter thread recently about serverless stuff Aaron Frost was noticing that like, hey, if it goes to sleep, it's 10 seconds to wake up. And basically a bunch of replies were, don't do serverless as you're like, oh, it's a panacea for all my problems of hosting. It's not it, right? It's really, it's a much smaller section of issues than people want you to believe, the people who like serverless and tout serverless.
Serverless is great, but it's not, it's not like, hey, I learned to do serverless. We're going to solve every problem with it now.
Right.
No.
Now we don't have a deployment pipeline. Now we don't have to do this like Google Cloud Functions. They just aren't going to solve a lot of your problems.
No.
They're wrong tool.
I've got a deep question for you, Dave, here. I'm going to put you on the spot. Two-part question. What do you recommend putting in this config? Like, what do you recommend? What kind of data as examples would you get before your app starts? And what kind of data would you also recommend not to?
In general, I would recommend putting anything in there that is going to change as you move from one environment to the other. Most of that, for in my experience, has been REST endpoints. But I've had situations where, and this is actually a good practice, where we've watermarked the application somehow with an image so that we know, okay, you're working in the dev environment now, or change the color or something. So that would be something worth putting in that config file in some way. But let's see what else we have in there.
I just while you're thinking, I've chimed in. The API endpoints were the number one thing I've always done.
Yeah.
If you want to hit a dev database versus a prod database versus staging, that's kind of important, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So we have basically application environment specific variables. So, if it's going to change.
Have you seen, and the reason I ask about things not to put in there, have you seen abuse of it? Because I know I have, where like all of a sudden,
that's so easy to do.
10,000 fields getting loaded when the app's starting. You're like, what are you thinking?
Right.
Well, I was thinking the admin username and password of the database.
Well, I've seen it. Depending on how big the application is, if you really need to load that many different endpoints or whatever you're loading at that point, you might think about putting it in a route guard so that you're only loading that information for the route that actually needs it.
Yeah, and I've seen for endpoints, I've worked with apps where you've had 1,000 endpoints, but you can always come up with a convention, right? So don't load the 1,000 endpoints. Load the convention that changes for all those endpoints. Yes. So it's only a field like dev versus prod. I've also seen, just thinking of stinky code, right? Code smells here. I've seen where somebody put in an app once, well, we need all the states and the countries and cities to be loaded before the app starts. We'll go ahead and do that. And I think there's a lot better ways to go about it than
right.
That can load while the app's loading, right? It doesn't have to be
right.
Before.
Yeah, that could be an aggressive lazy load. Sorry.
Yeah.
So how do you decide? How do you prioritize? So this is definitely, because for nubs like me, I'm like, I don't know, I'd probably put all the states there. Why not? So where's your line?
Well, the way I look at it is always don't put it there unless your app cannot function. You can't even load a service or a component, like the main component, without this information. And stuff, for example, states and countries, think about app component, the way in Angular. App component doesn't usually have visual interfaces. It's usually the shell of your app, right? There's no data needed for that, but you might need to know where are my database endpoints. You might need to know other environment specific stuff to get started. But then once your app component's loaded, then you can have resolvers or route guards or whatever you want to do to say, okay, before I load my customer search page, go ahead and go load all these things in the background.
So you're not saying load in your UI before it has things to populate it. You're just saying be wise about what you're putting in this config.
Yeah, because the first question Joe asked was head on, right? I think the reason speaking for Dave, and then he can answer if I'm totally off base. I think the reason Dave said he hasn't noticed a performance problem is because he doesn't go crazy loading stuff up front. Right, Dave? I hope. He froze.
Oh no! Here, I'll answer. Exactly. That's exactly what yes.
You sounded awesome. Dave, you froze. You're back now. But did you hear the question?
Yeah. It sounded, what you said sounded right. At least sounded you were in the right direction.
Well, one other thing that I've seen people do is they build something like a service that has to connect to something. You know, we're talking about a backend in this case. And so what they do is they put some flag in their config that says, this is production. And then their service has a conditional that goes, if it's production, hit this backend endpoint. And if it's staging, hit this one. And if it's dev, hit this one. And instead what you want is you just want in the config, this is the back end. And then it's just like, hit that back end. So it does a lookup. It caches that value in memory. And then when it does the lookup, it doesn't have to do that conditional every time. And so I guess the mistake that I see a lot is you can think about some of your configs kind of the way you think of dependency injection. And so then it doesn't have to know it's production. It just has to know where to get the data from.
So I have a question for our Angular expert here, Joe. And for Dave.
Mm-hmm.
Too. Sorry, I saw you disappear for a second, Alyssa. So our Angular experts, Joe and Alyssa and Dave. App Initializer at one point was experimental in the Angular API, and it no longer has that flag. Do you all know when that disappeared and when it became non-experimental? Because I don't.
I do not. That is a piece of trivia I would get the buzzer on.
My favorite answers to questions like these are sometime in 4.
it was between 4.0 and 4.1.
Oh my.
That's when everything
I was using this feature like 2 years ago when it was experimental, and I'm like, what the heck with it? It's great. I'll keep using it. And I just went to look at the docs right now, and I went back and looked at docs for 4 and 5 and 6, and it doesn't say it anymore. So maybe I dreamed it.
Wait, so it's not, you're saying it's still experimental?
I'm saying that the docs at one point said it was, and I can no longer prove that ever was experimental.
I love it. We're rewriting our own history.
Yeah,
that's it. I'm using that Stephen Fluent right now.
So
revisionist Git history.
I'd like to throw out a little bit of a counter argument to this particular method with a method that I've used in the past that I've really liked because it solves one of the problems, which is just yet one more GET request that I'm waiting around for, although it added a little bit of complexity. And that was, I used my index.html was actually a server-side rendered page, right? Like, and I don't mean like I'm using Angular server-side rendering like Angular Universal. I mean, like if I'm using Node, it's actually part of it's a template language, or if I'm using .NET, it's actually ASP.NET that produces my index.html page that then runs and loads up all of my bundles that are produced in the distribution directory. And the reason is because then you can embed right into the page all of your variables that are environment specific. It adds a bunch of complexity because now the backend server knows that it's on this environment, and so it has to know which client-side variables apply, and then it writes them in as it renders out that server-sided page and sends it down to the browser. Does that make sense to everybody? Did I explain that whole concept clearly enough?
You never make any sense to me, Joe.
No, it makes some sense to me. I mean, I do the same kind of thing with Rails, right? I tend not to try and insert configs into the server rendered pages, that Rails renders up. Just because I like to be able to, if I redeploy, I like to have it check in periodically and update itself. So if you redeploy, if I redeploy my app, but I guess if you set up the app initializer, it's going to load that in. It's not going to come back.
It's the same thing with app initializer, right? Yeah. So that's no different there. You'd have to be, for anything that isn't constantly being read from the server, it's going to be a one-time only. So Dave, did I explain that clearly enough? Do you understand it? Do you have some thoughts about that method versus using the app initializer and just creating an HTTP call?
Yeah, it was one of the things that John and I had talked about earlier in the show. And I think it works. I understand why you're doing it. I like having basically all my Angular code is static files, right? So it's not dependent on an endpoint, or it keeps my server side simple.
Right.
And, what your method is, it just moves the problem to the server instead of moving it to this app initializer. But as long as it's getting done and it's not getting done in the environment TS file,
Right.
I think it's a valid solution.
Or I think obviously your first point was try not to recompile differently based on your environment, right? Avoiding that is a great thing to do.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think one thing here too is that if you're putting any kind of config into your Express or .NET or Rails or whatever, then you have to have that config somewhere else if you want to use any of your Angular code, say in your tests, independent of the actual backend, and that could be a problem. So if you have it initialize against some static file it pulls up somewhere, then it gives you the flexibility, and you don't have two systems that are now coupled together by this config that you're putting in a server rendered file.
So can I ask a different question then, Dave?
Sure.
What about your configuration for your backend? Do you leave that into an environment file that you just place in the different servers?
There is
.NET has this nice little facility for all this, right?
I'm sorry?
.NET has this nice little facility for environment files that.
Yeah, we're actually using Node and Express. The piece that server needs to know about, we store in a server.config.json file. And we use the same deployment method to pick which one of those files for which server.
Gotcha.
Could we use that and dynamically generate the index.html? Probably, but then we'd have to figure out how to wire that into the index.html that is generated for us as part of the build process.
Now, I wasn't curious so much about you integrating it with the previous question. Just the
REST endpoints and that stuff.
No. Just the idea of, hey, for my Angular, I want the same exact thing. I can copy all these files. There's no environment file as I move them around, right? So on the server, do you follow the same, or do you have the same strictness with your rules, which is I don't even want an environment file. I want to be able to copy that whole server directory, move it from server to server. But if you're using
the server also has config files.
The server has a config file that you move around that is different based on which server it lives on. And you copy everything else, and then that file gets changed. Gotcha.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I would absolutely solve that problem 100% of the time. There's not really a great solution otherwise, but.
Right.
I've also stored information in environment files or in environment variables. And so then it's not even in a config file. Because the danger you run into there is if you have any secrets, like, say, your database password and things like that, the environment variables tend to be a little bit trickier to get to than copying a file out of there and then accessing your database with username and password.
Right.
Yeah, and there's things like cloud-based key vaults that will help with that stuff too. But I agree, you don't want to stick your passwords into files. Not a good idea anywhere.
Right. Yeah, and the other possible solution is to have the server and the client-side config file be the same config file. If it's not that, we're making the assumption it's not a big file to begin with.
Right.
And if both sides need the same information, you could easily just make it the same file.
This sort of conversation just makes me think of all the crazy things I've both seen done and done myself.
Yeah.
And it's fun. You get on the podcast, you talk about this, and it sounds so simple. And then the rubber starts hitting the road. You realize, okay, this works for 99% of my needs, but I got this one need that, oh my gosh, it would be so much easier if I violated that and did it this other way, right? And then pretty soon there's 10 of those, and all of a sudden you've got this crazy hodgepodge, and you're like, and the next guy comes along and says, the next person comes along and says, how in the world did you ever get here? And he said, well, when you stand, the perspective now says, this is really stupid. You made the journey with me.
No, that's when Joe starts crying and says, "Walk a day in my shoes."
That's right. It's like at every turn we made, at every decision point, we made a good decision at the moment. It was taken in aggregate that it turns out we did really, really, really stupid stuff.
Yeah, I've learned over the years that when I see something that doesn't look right, there's a story behind it.
Yeah. I read this great blog post. Basically, the point was, if you're not embarrassed about who you were 6 months ago, then you're not growing enough.
Mm. I think that slows down a little. I mean, you have to ask some of the guys who've been programming longer. But I do think that slows down a little bit.
I don't know. If you ask Ward, it doesn't get any easier. It never slows down, and you're always going to be fighting.
Yeah, I heard that comments.
Listen, if anybody's embarrassed about who they were 6 months ago.
Well, that's the thing too, right? Is that sometimes we're aware that there's a big area of knowledge that we don't have. And sometimes we have these blind spots. And so, 6 months from now, you're going, well, if I had only known, that was really a dumb thing to do. Or
right.
If I'd only known this technique, then my code would be cleaner or whatever. And
I don't know.
But yeah.
On another podcast, we talked about the whole mood tools and this whole smush flatten issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And for those that aren't familiar with that, I'm going to try to explain it, and John or Chuck or Dave or Alyssa, if I say anything wrong, correct me. But the TC39 wanted to add flatten to arrays, right? And then they discovered that mood tools was using they were manipulating the prototype of objects and adding it their own flatten. And so when they did this, they actually broke a fair number of big sites that are older, were built back in the day where Mood Tools was a really popular project and just haven't been updated to newer versions of Mood Tools. And so they went back and changed the name from Flatten to Smush in order to not break the internet. And it wasn't that there was anything in a specification that had gotten broken. It was just that this third-party tool, they had decided to do this thing and manipulate the prototypes, which later on became a widespread do not do this thing, right? But at the time, that when they wrote it, it wasn't nearly as commonly said, do not manipulate the prototypes of common objects.
Mm.
So but yeah, my point being that, again, it's one of those, hey, at the time, it was we felt like it was a good decision.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is interesting to take from that is that this is a lesson that had been learned by Java and by .NET, by other communities before then. And it was just, for whatever reason, Mood Tools didn't pick up on, hey, this is a really terrible idea until much later. And so I think a lot of times we discount the knowledge that people who, aren't one of us have learned the hard way. And so we have to learn it the hard way too.
Well, to be fair, and I can't speak for that situation, I agree with what you're both saying, but I also think sometimes the technologies, as they evolve and change, maybe the decision isn't as terrible on one technology as another. Sometimes
that's fair,
right?
At least, I don't understand enough about Ruby, for example, to know if everything I would do in .NET or in Node or Go would be the same as it is in Ruby or not.
Yeah,
I would go into it thinking the paradigms are the same, but I think the best story there is probably just to go ask a Ruby expert in that case, right? Like go call Chuck and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Does this sound like a great idea?" Or is this awful?
I haven't done .NET in a long time, but when extension methods became a thing, I was super excited. I thought they were really awesome. And I don't know if they're at all considered an anti-pattern or a code smell now, but I think that's kind of like .NET's version of modifying the prototype. Only what's nice is it's scoped to just the file that you're in. You're just saying, hey, right here, this object now has this additional method, but it doesn't anywhere else.
Yeah, they're weird. I got to tell you, extension methods are weird in .NET. I was excited when they came out too, but then the next day, I saw my entire team implemented 400 things as extension methods. Stop.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too. I mean, you go into that idea again, and Ruby is very open to extending classes, and
Ruby's
there are
like
all these best practices that come up around it.
Isn't Ruby like JavaScript where you could take a single instance and add more methods to it?
Yes.
Yeah. .NET.
Dave, do you TypeScript or do you JavaScript or what do you do?
Oh, I'm all TypeScript.
All TypeScript?
Do you only do Angular?
Right now, I'm only doing Angular. Yes.
Do you use TypeScript in your Node though?
No, primarily because the Node part of it is so trivial. It wasn't worth the extra effort.
That makes sense.
To compile it, from TypeScript down into. A matter of fact, when I got there, it was in TypeScript, and I converted it from TypeScript to straight up JavaScript.
Joe, do you do your Node in TypeScript?
I'm sorry?
I do. As a rule, I wouldn't say I do it 100% of the time because, like, in the case of me, I oftentimes just throw together quick little Express servers that I spend like 20 minutes on. But if I like TypeScript in my Node servers.
If I were doing a big server, I definitely would do more TypeScript there.
What about ES6?
The type safety that I get from TypeScript has solved more problems I didn't know I have.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons that I wrote this article, and I write a lot of the articles that I do, is because I'm constantly looking for ways to write my code that will prevent bugs from being introduced into the system, so that I actually end up with less code that needs to be tested. The old TDD argument that's shown up on the show several times. So I do things like force cyclomatic complexity to 10, which is really small. Suggested is 20.
Wow.
I make heavy use of NGRX and effects and RxJS, and which again, by their nature, done correctly, force you to write smaller individual pieces that are much easier to reason about. And so by the time you get all this stuff in place, the amount of code that really needs to be tested is quite small. One of the other things that I do is I put, if I have a component that's got logic tied to it, I put all that logic in a service. I make the service do the logic, and the component is just responsible for sending messages, because I use NGRX, sending actions out to NGRX and rendering the data that the NGRX system produces. It doesn't do anything in terms of logic. And so if I were to test anything, I would test the service. I don't have to actually have a whole, gazillion lines of test harness code set up to test my component, because my component is just rendering. And again, it makes the code easier to reason about.
Right.
Yeah.
Stepping back a little bit, but for your Node, are you doing it just ES5 or then?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Again, it's very trivial, so I haven't. There's very little in there that would need to go beyond that, even if I had it.
Maybe it's just me. On a small project, I wouldn't care so much about TypeScript, but it's the ES6 stuff that I really miss.
In TypeScript, you miss it?
Well, if I was doing a Node service and I'm writing my code in ES5, it's the ES6 stuff that I miss, which Node is supporting more and more ES6, but with
which is pretty much everything that TypeScript and ES6 or whatever, ES 4 million.
Yeah. I say ES6 really meaning ES 2018, right?
Yeah. They're all, pretty much, I did a talk the other day with Brian Clark, a buddy of mine, and he's like, what's the difference between TypeScript and ES whatever now? I'm like, honestly, there's very little that's like additional features in TypeScript over the standard. There's interfaces, there's the types themselves, things like that. But a couple things like auto initializing constructor parameters. But to me, it's more the tooling that I still miss.
I have a feeling that a little bird told you that. A duck.
Oh, is he my son?
Nobody can see this that's going to be listening to this, but John's son has a little Donald Duck that's been on John's shoulder for the last 5 minutes.
Yes.
And Boba Fett's on John's microphone now.
Yes, Boba Fett's on my microphone. And who's this, Landon?
Yeah, it's not Donald.
Dewey.
That's Dewey, right?
Yeah.
All right, from what show?
DuckTales.
But which one's better, Huey, Dewey, or Louie?
I like Dewey.
Okay. Why? Why do you like Dewey?
I don't know. I just like him.
Yeah. That's a good answer.
So, we should
And
get Landon on the podcast one of these days. He takes a coding class at school. And he's already a better coder than I am. So
that's awesome. That's the kind of answer that most people should give when you ask them why they use a particular technology. They really should be honest and say, I don't know, I just like it. It's the most honest answer.
Mm.
There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. And then you can't argue with it either.
Yeah, that's totally true.
All right. Well, anything else that we should jump on here before we go to picks?
I think we've already gone pretty far off the reservation.
Yeah. Well, what was the topic again, Dave? I totally forgot.
I think the topic was the new version of Rails, right? That was what we were talking about today.
Yeah.
Well, before we do that, though, I'd like to kind of wrap up on Dave's article if we could. I was skim reading it again, and I just tweeted it out because it's really well done. So thank you.
Thank you.
The app initializer. I think the thing that people most often forget, and I love that you went over this, is the two struggles I see people have is one, what if your app initializer has dependencies? And you cover that in your article. Like to actually make the call over HTTP, maybe you want to use HTTP client and you show how you can do that or add your other things in. And the second part is after the data comes back, you got to put it somewhere. And you cover that too. Like you're not just making a call and then the data comes back and it goes into the ether. You need a way to store that in something. And I think you call yours a config service. So I just want to call out that it was well done and you hit all the important points.
Thank you.
I did have another question, and that was mostly just around testing. So where do you put your configs for your test? I mean, if you're isolating things or doing dependency injection, you may not need app initializer. Or maybe you do, and I just don't. Anyway.
Yeah, you talk about unit testing or?
Yeah, unit testing in particular. If you're doing end-to-end testing, it's loading the whole thing, so.
Yeah, and again, because I try to stick to a more functional way of coding in general, I generally don't test the services that these configs are going to need because the services are just going out and retrieving the data from the endpoint. They work or they don't.
Yep.
What I have been chewing on in the back of my mind is some kind of config to provide a mock service that would return a known set of data. So I could actually config my dependency injections to use mock data or use the real service, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Makes sense. All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. John, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just laughing. My son's having a great time here today. It's the first week of school, and we're having a good time together, aren't we, buddy?
Yeah.
So my first pick is going to be an awesome cartoon that me and my son and my daughters all watch, and that is the new DuckTales that Disney's put out. They redid the show that was out when I was younger on TV, and they redid the thing completely. And it's actually a lot of fun. It's a cartoon, but it's a lot of fun, and we enjoy watching it. It's funny and entertaining all at the same time. My second pick is going to be a thing called Sketch Notes. I may have talked about this in the past, but I'm really, really loving doing this. I've been learning how to use my limited artistic abilities to write like notes and take things. The hardest thing I have is I watch a video or I go to a conference and I can't keep up with what the person's talking about, but I want to remember this. And this would have been great in college back when I went in the Stone Age. But now I just literally can pull out a pad and I can draw my notes using icons and figures and things like that with a couple words in there using 1 or 2 or 3 colors. And I can go back and look at it later and remember it. And the most important thing is I can keep paying attention while I'm listening to a talk and still take notes. I find it fascinating. It's really easy to do. I use a combination of them holding it up, a thing called Rocketbook, which is what I use a lot. Like, here's my notes so the other people in the show can see it. And then I also use my iPad sometimes to do it, depending upon where I am. But check it out. It's called Sketchnoting. There's a couple books on it, a couple videos. Give it a try.
Hey, your Rocket Note. Have you found a pen that works well with it?
Yes. These are the Frixion pens. Just make sure you get the ones that have English on them, because I found the ones that have other writing on them from other countries. I think it's Chinese, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
It might be Japanese. I can't remember. But the ones that had the other writing on it, I learned they work just as well. But I was told by the websites that they are not as good for you, like chemically. So make sure you get the right Frixion pens.
I got the 2 that come with the Rocketbook when you buy it and tried them. They were both absolutely 100% horrible. They wrote so light, I couldn't see anything.
Yeah,
they were ridiculous.
Well, you can get different weights too. You got to search around. Like I got, I think it's the 7mm, the 5mm. I also got markers. I'd be happy to share all this information with you.
You should pick Rocketbook then.
Yes, Rocketbook's awesome. Just don't get the one you can microwave. And if you don't know why, I'm not going to tell you anymore. Go Google it. You can actually microwave one of these books. It's weird. But don't get that one. Get the regular one.
All right. Joe, what are your picks?
All right. So I'm just going to I mentioned, of course, to pick the Framework Summit. Awesome conference coming up in October. Tickets are still on sale. And my other pick is going to be a book based on some conversation we were having about the comment John's son made about, I don't know why, I just like it. The book is called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree on Religion and Politics. I think that's roughly the subtitle. I mean, I may be quoting it a little bit wrong, but it's this amazing book about how the human mind works and the fact that we decide what we like first and then we justify why we like it later on. But we think that we're picking things because of some arbitrary thought process, and he lays it all out through all. It's a scientist that's done a ton of study in this sort of. It's the most fascinating book. I've read it, I think, 3 times now. For a nonfiction book, that's a lot for me. It's super exciting. So when I heard his comment, I don't know why I just like it. That totally rings true to me. That's how the human brain works. So you should, if you're interested at all in human psychology and how people behave and behavior, you should absolutely check out this book and read it. I picked it a couple of times in the past, I'm sure.
Makes sense. People make an emotional decision and then a logical argument for it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to jump in here with a couple of picks. The first one I have is we recently got the Nintendo Switch, and I've been playing Breath of the Wild, which is the Zelda version for the Switch, and I've really, really been enjoying it, so I'm going to pick that. It's a ton of fun. It also came with what is it, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which is more or less the same as Mario Kart 8, except you have 2 power-up slots instead of 1. And so that's been fun to play with my kids. My daughter's actually getting pretty good at it, my 11-year-old. So we had a good time. And then I'm also just going to call out briefly the Get a Coder Job book and videos. So if you go to devchat.tv/shop, or you can go to getacoderjob.com, you should be able to get the videos or the ebook if you just want the ebook. And yeah, I've guaranteed that to be out by Labor Day. The book might be in kind of a rough draft-ish form, but it will be complete. It'll have all the information in it. So anyway, I'll put that out there. Dave, what are your picks?
So I'm going to repick the high-fat, low-carb diet, or paleo, or whatever your flavor is. But I guess the thing that's most impressed me recently is tailored clothes. I've been pretty much thin my whole life and always worn clothes that are bigger than I really need. And there is a site now, MTailor, that will take a video of you and make clothes that actually fit you. And it's so easy, and there's no tape measure involved. Got my first shirt last week, and it's the first shirt that really fits. So I'm going to go with that. Toss the link in.
Awesome. And if people want to find you online, where do they find you?
Yeah, I'm Dave M. Bush pretty much everywhere. I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. If you send me a connection, I'll accept it. And then my GitHub account will probably be the second most likely place to find me, where I've moved my blog. I mean, when you initially found the article, it was on another website that I have since retired because I've moved to a full-time job. So I've moved all that content over to my GitHub, to a GitHub pages blog.
Cool. Well, thanks again for coming, Dave.
And thank you.
All right. Well, we'll wrap this up and we will be back next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.